Darren leads a normal life, is popular at school, is an excellent student, pleases his parents, and has many friends. But there is one person who doesn't fit into Darren's normal life, his best friend, Steve. The latter invites him to skip school. The boy agrees reluctantly. Steve then makes Darren break the school's light bulb. For this reason, Darren is scolded by his teacher and parents. At home, his mother scolds him in despair and forbids him to be friends with Steve. His father also believes that Steve is ruining Darren's life. According to the parents, the right path is a great college, a stable job, and a family. A terrifying cycle of college, work, and family runs through his mind. The boy understands that he doesn't want to live like that, but he doesn't contradict his parents. The next day, Darren informs Steve that their friendship must now remain a secret so as not to anger his parents. Steve is outraged by this news and insults Darren for not wanting to fight. Their discussion is interrupted by a vintage car with "Destiny" written on the license plate. An unknown man throws a flyer out of the window and drives away. The flyer falls at Darren's feet. The boys understand that this is an invitation to an extravagant circus show. They want to go there, but Darren is prohibited from going out in the city for 2 months. However, that evening, Darren sneaks out of the house and goes to the circus with Steve. The friends arrive at an old theater building and notice a red moon of blood. Steve loves the show because he's obsessed with vampires, and Darren with spiders. The boys buy tickets from a strange dwarf and enter the hall. The show begins. The presenter with a big, strange-shaped head announces the entry of the werewolf. With a howl, the werewolf approaches a woman in the audience. A few moments later, the werewolf bites the woman's arm. She screams, and the rest of the audience is terrified. The werewolf escapes, and the woman with the bitten arm goes on stage. Her hand immediately regrows because this artist is the queen of regeneration. Next is Alexander. He has no skin, and his internal organs are visible. The audience is also entertained by a woman with giant teeth and a man with 2 stomachs, capable of digesting any object. Next on stage is a man with snake skin named Evra, and then a spectacular woman, Madame Truskar. The woman invites Darren to become her assistant. She touches the boy, and a long beard grows on him. Madame Truskar looks into Darren's eyes and sees his future. She feels that something bad is about to happen. They are followed by a wizard named Lartun Crepsley and his spider, Madame Octa. The man flies onto the stage. Darren, hypnotized, can't take his eyes off the spider. Madame Octa's bite promises certain death, but Crepsley manages to control her by playing the flute. Suddenly, Steve informs Darren that the wizard is a real vampire because his portrait is featured in one of the vampire books. In the meantime, the wizard releases Madame Octa and falls on Darren's foot. Crepsley, at this point, comes near the boy, takes the spider, and says that vampires do not exist. And if anyone knew them, they'd be strangled by them in their sleep. The show ends when a crowd of people enters the hall, taking advantage of the general confusion. Darren sneaks backstage. Here, he finds Crepsley's dressing room and is fascinated by Octa. No one is in the dressing room, but there is a coffin. Darren approaches Octa's cage. He sees the spider and plays the flute for her. Suddenly, voices are heard outside the door. Darren takes the cage, puts it in his bag, and hides in a closet. Crepsley and a friend named Gavner enter. From their conversation, it becomes clear that they are vampires. Recently, their friend was killed by the vampire's enemies, the Vampanese. The Vampanese friends also talk about the mysterious return of Tiny from another world. Gavner believes that Tiny imagines himself as the arbiter of fate and wants to destroy vampires with the help of Vampanese. Gavner wants to fight vampires and avenge his friend's death, but Crepsley refuses to go with him. He is against the war. At that moment, Steve enters. He is sure that the wizard and Gavner are vampires. Steve asks to be transformed as well. Crepsley says that by becoming a vampire, he will have to leave his family and friends, so it's a bad idea. But Steve complains about his dysfunctional family and insists on being transformed. Then Crepsley tastes Steve's blood and immediately spits it out. Steve has bad blood, so he cannot become a vampire. The boy becomes angry and threatens the vampires with violence, but the men quickly throw him out of the dressing room. Gavner leaves, and Crepsley starts to look for Octa. Darren, who has been in the closet all this time, opens the secret door and runs away. He is immediately picked up by a black car. This happens in front of Crepsley. Mr. Tiny himself and one of the vampires are in the car. Tiny invites Darren to join them, but the boy gets out and escapes. The next day, Darren goes to school. He opens the locker and admires Octa. Steve realizes that Darren was in Crepsley's dressing room and overheard their entire conversation. At that moment, the bell rings for a break. Steve, surprised, throws Octa's cage with the spider. The door opens, and the spider escapes. The corridor fills with students, and a deadly spider walks on the floor, pushing everyone aside. Steve follows Octa with a broom and wants to kill her. Darren runs after Steve and tries to save Octa. The spider senses danger and bites Steve on the cheek. The boy loses consciousness, and Octa escapes. Darren decides to help his friend, who is near death, and goes to Crepsley to get an antidote, but the man calls Darren a petty thief and refuses to help him for free. During the conversation, Crepsley realizes that Darren is in serious danger because of Tiny. Crepsley offers Darren a deal. He will turn him into a half-vampire and make him his assistant. In return, Crepsley will protect Darren from Tiny and save Steve. The boy wants to do anything to save his friend but doesn't want to kill people. Crepsley explains that the Vampires kill, not the vampires. After some hesitation, Darren accepts the plan. Crepsley performs a blood exchange ceremony, and Darren falls to the ground and feels cold. He is now a half-vampire. Then they go together to the hospital where Steve is held. The vampire injects the antidote to Steve. The boy's heart begins to beat faster. Darren tries to confront Crepsley, but the vampire is not influenced by silly tricks. Steve soon recovers and even goes back to school. Darren develops a craving for raw meat. He also has a thirst for blood and almost attacks his sister. Crepsley is already waiting for him in his room. He says that Darren will have to leave his family. To do this, it is necessary to pretend that he is dead. The boy bids farewell to his family, trying not to scare them. Darren and Crepsley are on the roof. Suddenly, the vampire distracts him and breaks his neck. Darren can't move. He will survive, but his death must be fake for now. Crepsley throws Darren off the roof and disappears. Everyone believes he is dead. On the day of the funeral, Steve approaches the coffin, leaves his phone, and notices that he has vampire-like claws. Steve now considers him a traitor. At night, Crepsley arrives at the cemetery and digs up Darren's coffin. The boy comes out of the grave. A vampire named Murloc jumps down from a tree in the cemetery. Crepsley smells the putrid scent and orders Darren to go back into the coffin. Murloc attacks Crepsley. A fierce battle begins. The opponents destroy all the tombstones in their path and then fall into Darren's grave. Crepsley tries to protect the boy and cover him. Murloc is about to win, but Crepsley hits him in the head with a shovel and throws Darren out of the grave. Miraculously, Crepsley and Darren manage to escape from the cemetery, but Murloc follows them. Crepsley reaches the road and arranges everything so that Murloc is hit by a car. Later, he takes Darren to a circus. Crepsley visits the director named Toll and asks him to let Darren stay because Tiny is looking for him. Meanwhile, Darren meets a girl named Rebecca, and they both overhear the conversation. Toll allows Darren to stay as long as he works for the good of the camp. Darren will share the tent with a boy named Evra, who has snake-like skin. In the tent, Darren promises not to drink his blood, and, in turn, Evra allows Darren to play the drums. Meanwhile, Steve continues to go to school. He can't forget Darren and decides to end his life, but at the last moment, Tiny stops him. He says that Darren is still alive, but has become a vampire and has betrayed Steve. Tiny says that his possibilities are unlimited, but he lacks an assistant. Steve is perfect for this role. In the evening, Tiny's car arrives at the camp of freaks. During a conversation with Toll and Crepsley, he announces the imminent start of a war between the Vampires and vampires. According to the prophecy, 2 young people will lead the war, so Tiny asks them to take Darren with them. Toll asks for time to think. The next day, Darren and Rebecca talk quietly and become closer. Rebecca confesses that she is a monkey girl. She has a tail, but Darren is not ashamed of her. In the evening, Crepsley teaches Darren to fight like a vampire because he understands the danger that threatens him. But the boy doesn't have enough strength because he hasn't drunk blood yet. Crepsley believes he can fix that. Meanwhile, the Vampires arrive at the monsters' camp. They search for Darren everywhere. The boy can't defend himself because he's too weak. Crepsley comes to help him. He hides Darren in his coffin. The monsters kick the Vampires out, but they kidnap Rebecca and tell Darren that he has to go home. In the evening, Darren goes to his old home, but no one is there because Tiny and Steve have kidnapped his family. The boy understands that his parents have been taken to the old theater, where the circus was held. Murloc meets Darren at the theater, ties up the boy's family, and hangs them on stage. Steve arrives shortly after. He talks about the people he has already killed and how much he enjoys it. Steve proposes to Darren to kill Rebecca and drink her blood, so his family will be free. After that, Darren will have to join the Vampires, but the boy refuses. Unfortunately, he cannot defend himself because he has not yet drunk blood, but Crepsley arrives to help him. A fight with Murloc begins. Mr. Tiny observes with interest, but does not intervene with his tail. Rebecca frees herself from the rope and goes to Darren. She offers him to drink some of her blood, but he is afraid that he won't be human anymore. Rebecca convinces him to take this step. He eventually drinks her blood. The fight between Crepsley and Murloc becomes increasingly violent. Steve also enters the fight and stabs Crepsley with a silver knife. But then Darren, who has drunk blood and become stronger, attacks Steve. At that moment, Crepsley takes out the knife and stabs it into Murloc's heart. He dies and with his last breath predicts that the war will certainly begin now. Tiny is delighted with what is happening and thanks all the participants for the show. Darren believes that the war won't start if no one knows what happened, so he fights with Steve. Old friends are now enemies, but he cannot kill Steve. Tiny separates the adversaries with a slight movement. It is not yet time to kill each other. All of this has been foretold long ago, and the decisive battle will take place later. Darren offers Steve one last chance to join him, but Steve refuses. Later, Tiny takes Murlocker's soul from his body. At the same time, the body becomes small and wrinkled but still alive. Tiny and Steve go to the Vampaneze, and Crepsley hypnotizes Darren's parents so they won't remember the events of that night. Leaving the house, Darren finally kisses Rebecca because he's been dreaming of it for a long time. The friends return to the camp. Here, most vote for Darren to stay. However, Gavner visits Crepsley and says that it's time for the three of them to go to the Vampaneze. Darren still doesn't know and is content with how it ended.